Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this FEST virtual Southeastern Regional Seminar in African Studies Conference. This spring's conference is free. It's also the first time that it's free and open to everyone because of the pandemic. Before we dive in, please note that the event is being recorded. Also, at any time during the event, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to send in questions for our keynote speaker. You can also raise your hands using the button below if you want to speak. CESAS is a multidisciplinary group of Africanist scholars in colleges and universities in the Southeast, and this conference takes place twice a year. This year's spring conference is hosted by the African Studies Center here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Our keynotes address this evening marks the official opening of this conference. The theme for this conference is African Mobilities, the Means and Modalities of Movements Within and Beyond Africa. The context of COVID-19 is an opportunity to interrogate the means and modalities of movement in Africa. One of the striking elements of the pandemic in African contexts is the power of social movements. In spite of, indeed, because of the pandemic, widespread public protests calling for the resignation of the president of Mali, the hashtag #EndSARS protests against police brutality and corruption in Nigeria, and demonstrations in Khartoum to protest poor living conditions and economic strife are all examples of the power of social movement, physical gathering, and marching, even within the context of a pandemic. Examples such as these are just to interrogate the multiple meanings of movement and movements in the context of Africa, from deep in the past to our volatile present. Before we dive in, I would like to acknowledge the powerhouse behind today's conference. Thank you to the University of Florida team, especially Associate Director Todd Leedy and Director Brianda Chalfane, the CESAS committee, particularly Christopher Day, and the African Studies Center team, Stacy Sewell and Abby Wakol. Thank you. Also, thank you to my director, Emily Burrell, who is on research leave, but yet worked hard on this. And my name is Ada Umewaleri. I am the Associate Director of the African Studies Center here at UNC, and currently holding the stead as Acting Director while Emily is on leave. Our keynote speaker is Professor Omar Ali, and the topic of his address is Malik Amba, Ethiopian Migration in World History. Omar H. Ali is Dean of Lloyd International Honors College and Professor of Comparative African Diaspora History at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He's also the author of Malik Amba, Power and Slavery Across the Indian Ocean. He's co-editor of Afro-South Asia in the Global African Diaspora and co-curator of the exhibit, The African Diaspora in the Indian Ocean World, with Sylviane Diouf at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. He's a founder of the Ethiopian and East African Studies at UNCG, a graduate of London School of Economics and Political Science. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University. Professor Ali is a migration and movement expert. Welcome, Professor Ali. I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Ada, for that introduction, and thank you for organizing this event. It's been a long week, I'm sure, for many of us on the call. And so what I want to do is present and then open up for as much conversation as possible, because for me, that's probably the most interesting part, is hearing what people receive and how we can build together conversations. So thank you. I will go ahead and share screen. So give me just 1 second to do that, and we'll get started. Let me do this. Okay. I'm assuming you can see this, yes? Thumbs up, yes, okay, perfect, okay, good. All right, so this is a topic that's near and dear to me as somebody who has been exploring the global African diaspora. And you have to begin in Africa as a continent and the mobility within Africa. But if there's any one person that can give really extraordinary expression to the migration of people out of Africa going towards the Indian Ocean world, I believe Malik Ambar is a great example. So I want to tell you a little bit about who this person is and understanding this general concept of African mobilities. So let me see, I'm trying to go to the next slide. Let me push to this, oops, going too far. So some of you might recognize this image. This is an image of Bilal ibn Rabah, who was one of the companions, capital C, of the Prophet Muhammad. And he's depicted here on top of the Kaaba, which is basically the center for the Muslim world, where people go to pilgrimage in Mecca. And this is historically inaccurate in the sense that it didn't have this black covering on top of it at that time, but it is accurate in that it's showing Bilal. And if you look closely, you could see that phenotypically he's being depicted as darker skin. And that's because his mother was Ethiopian and his father was an Arab, and his mother was enslaved and he was enslaved. And he had heard about the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad and decided to follow this idea of one single God, Allah. And for that, he was actually tortured by his master, who wanted him to venerate or to worship the two daughters of Allah, who was understood to be the creator God, but there were other deities, semi-deities and lower deities. And the fundamental teaching in Islam is that there is only one God. And so he was tortured because he continued to assert this. And the young Muslim community had heard about this obstinate slave named Bilal. And so they decided to pool their money together and purchase him. And so in some ways, he becomes the first manumitted slave in Islamic history. And so he becomes a member of the Muslim community and will have spread the faith over the coming decades. And I begin with him because there is an African diaspora outside of Africa. The word diaspora means spreading. It's often, its origins come from the notion of the Jewish diaspora, the spreading of Jews in different parts of the world. But Africans had been moving within Africa. We know the great Bantu migration, for instance, but there were all kinds of migrations within Africa. So I think that we have to understand that there's movement within Africa and then outside. And so in the Indian Ocean world, you see very early on this African presence being depicted in images, in the stories, in Muslim tradition. There are the stories of the early Muslim community are told in the Hadith or the Sunnah. And so that's why we know about Bilal ibn Rabah. So there is this African presence, an Ethiopian presence early on. And if we look at some of the other documentary evidence, this is the spreading of Islam. But I want to show this map. Can you see my cursor by any chance? Can you see it? Okay. So there are these monsoons that flow, the wind and the ocean currents that go basically counterclockwise, if you will. It's not quite, but for about 4 months in the year. Then they slow down, they stop for 4 months, and then they reverse course. And that has allowed for the flow of people and products and ideas going back thousands and thousands of years. And so we have early evidence of African contacts in India in the area of the Horn of Africa, specifically in the area of Somalia and Ethiopia, going back to the 1st century Common Era in what a document called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. So we have documentary evidence going back that far. We also have evidence of gold coins being found across the ocean. And so we know that there's exchange of goods and people and, of course, products. And so by the time Islam arises in the 7th century, you see this sort of the flow of Islam and the spreading of it that will take place over the coming centuries. And there is a lot of overlap in terms of the Indian Ocean world's trade networks and Muslim traders and merchants and sailors. And so Africans would join those networks. In fact, they would initiate some of those. And they would adopt some of the conventions of Islam. This is a mosque on the other side of the African continent in the area of Mali. But what Islam does, and this is a thesis of one of my books called Islam in the Indian Ocean World, is that Islam, and this is true of other religions, takes on the characteristics of the people and places into which it goes. So Islam looks different in different parts of the world because it's moving into different cultures. And that changes the overall character of what Islam is. So Islam, the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean world, and Malik Ambar, we're starting to pull together some pieces here. People moved in different kinds of ships. There is a class of ships called dhows, D-H-O-W-S, dhows. And this is an early image of one. And if you kind of squint your eyes, you can kind of see in the bottom here, you have phenotypically much darker skinned people down here. And what they're doing is they're actually taking water out of the hull, because dhows oftentimes leak very slowly, because the way that they're built is they have the planks of wood sewn together so that when they come up against the shore, they don't crack apart like many European ships that were built with nails. They're much more rigid and don't have that give that can allow them to kind of come up to the sandy shores. So they're pouring out water, and they're carrying merchants. This is somewhere in the Persian Gulf, presumably western side of the Indian Ocean, around there. And you can see the crew here are probably a mix of Africans and Indians, Afro-Indians there. So you have these Africans coming out of the Horn of Africa and a little bit further down the Swahili coast, moving across the western side of the Indian Ocean up the Red Sea, ultimately up into the Ottoman Empire there, into Arabia, into Baghdad, Iran, and then making their way to Pakistan and India and Sri Lanka. So the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean is mostly this area of the western part. There is a presence of Africans going all the way out to the eastern side of the Indian Ocean. And there's famously a black samurai that emerges a couple centuries after Malik Ambar. And there are Africans in parts of Southeast Asia that were brought by the Dutch, for instance, but again, closer to our time period. But for centuries, Africans were moving about in this western part of the Indian Ocean. And we know about some of them through images. And so this is a painting of Malik Ambar. So I want to tell you a little bit about his life. Malik Ambar was born in approximately 1548. He was born Oromo. Oromo are one of several large ethnic groups, nations really, in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia, as is the case of the rest of Africa, is extremely diverse. Extremely linguistically diverse, culturally diverse. In Ethiopia alone, there are about 80 distinct languages. And so you can imagine the variety of people there and the different lifestyles and what have you. So he was born Oromo, and he was born at a time where basically Muslim forces on the coast had just sort of finished these long battles, the wars against Christian forces up in the mountains, all black, by the way. So although some of them did enlist European allies for a time, and his people had moved up from basically the area of Kenya into this area. And he was at some point in his youth swept into the slave trading system. He was probably grabbed. Some authors claim that he was sold by his parents, but there's no documentary evidence of that. Most likely he was captured as one of the subjects as a sort of a casualty of war, if you will. And he was taken to Arabia, southern Arabia, the area of Mocha. And then he either went up the the Red Sea, or across and up the Persian Gulf. But we know that he ends up in Baghdad. And Baghdad is no longer sort of the golden city that it was earlier, especially after the Mughals, the Mongol invasion in the 13th century. But it's still a glorious, extraordinary city. And he's there with a new slave owner and he gets sold a couple of times on his route there. And he is given an education. And many people might scratch their head and not realize that that's actually what happened to enslaved people. Slavery, as if you grew up in the Atlantic world, if you grew up in the United States or in other parts of, the Atlantic, you tend to have a very biased view of what it means to be a slave. You automatically equate Blackness with slavery. But if you lived in an earlier time, and if you live in other parts of the world, slaves were mostly prisoners of war. That's where they were. And so they could be of any background. But clearly with the transatlantic slave trade, there became sort of a real connection between slavery and phenotypical Blackness. And so there was wiggle room in the Indian Ocean world that you don't see. That is the possibilities for upward social mobility among enslaved people. And so, so Africans were sometimes, who were enslaved, were sometimes given an education, and they were given other kinds of things to train them. And so Malik Ambar is one of those people who did that. He would go on to the Deccan in India, where he was sold again. And interestingly, to another person who was of Ethiopian background. His name was Malik Dabir, who was the regent minister. So basically, the person who was running the show in one of the sultanates in the Western Deccan, which is the central part of India on the Western coast. And he is taken under the wing by this fellow Ethiopian, who again is Ethiopian. He was an enslaved subject as part of 1,000 slaves that this regent minister had, so large scale. And Malik Ambar was a quick study. He obviously learned lots very quickly, and would end up, when his master was killed, basically becoming a mercenary general. And he would go on to serve several kingdoms, and there are sultanates, Muslim-led kingdoms in the Western Deccan, and would then settle in the kingdom or sultanate of Ahmednagar and become its regent minister. And basically for a quarter century, from basically 1600 to about 1625, he was the de facto ruler. So you have an African ruler in Western India with troops that are both Abyssinians, which is another term for Ethiopians, Marathis, who are Hindu soldiers and cavalry in particular, and these what are called Persians, sort of more phenotypical, lighter skinned Indians. And so you have this multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious army that he's commanding. And he wasn't the only person, but he is the most extraordinary, basically using diplomacy, using guerrilla warfare, which is called Badigiri, and oftentimes accepting defeat for the short term to then turn around and then push out the main people who were trying to take over that area, who were fellow Muslims, but from the imperial Mughals up north in India. And so for a quarter of a century, you have this presence of Malik Ambar, and it was only within a couple of years after he dies that the Mughals were able to take over. So that's sort of a snapshot. So what happens to these communities? Many of them sort of incorporate themselves into the rest of the population, but many remain distinctly their own communities. And this is one of the Siddi communities, S-I-D-D-I. There are multiple names used for people of African descent in India or in South Asia in general. Siddi or Sidi was just one D, like in Pakistan. Habshi is another term that's used, comes from Habasha. You also have a term that in South Africa is a derogatory term, but has been actually taken up by the people of Sri Lanka of African descent, which is the word kafir, which means unbeliever or non-believer. And it's the equivalent of like the N-word in North America. But it doesn't have that same kind of connotation there as it does in South Africa or in Southern Africa. And so the Afro-Indians or Afro-Sri Lankans call themselves the Kafirs. And so there are these African communities, and this is just one of them. This is in the area of Gujarat in Western India, and who maintain their own practices, very percussive practices, but not exclusively. They also use stringed instruments, these lyres that they use, and other instruments. And they are Muslims, they're Hindu, they're Christians. They're in some ways, whatever the dominant religion was in the area, they tended to adopt it. But like all religions, as I said, going back to my thesis about Islam taking on the characteristics of the people and places into which it goes, they bring their own, if you will, African, which of course is many different things, sensibilities. We know that ethnically we have the Oromo there, but we also have Makua, which is further down the coast of Eastern Africa, among other ethnic groups of people who are going to populate this area of India. And so Malik Ambar may be one of the most extraordinary ones, but there are other figures and contemporaries, and we have these extraordinary images. And this is Ilkis Khan. In my class when I teach, what I do is I ask, what do you see? Something I learned from art historians is to say, ask students, what do you see here? And some might say, well, he's holding some piece of paper. Well, what does that mean? Probably that he's literate, right? Turns out it's a petition. What else do you see there? Well, you see him, he has his hand on a sword, perhaps signifying power, that he's in charge, right? He's wearing these beautiful sort of attire. He's looking very majestic, if you will. And another feature is that a phenotypically lighter skinned person is serving him, which is unusual for many people, again, in the Atlantic world, where it's usually darker skinned people serving lighter skinned people. And so this is somebody who is his servant, somebody who is assisting him. So the Indian Ocean world is very helpful because it teaches us that migration and mobility into different parts of the world can give us perspective that not all experiences out of Africa would turn out to be what we quintessentially see as the enslaved subject in the Atlantic world of a particular kind on a plantation, because we know that the forced migration of Africans across the Atlantic also took many different forms once arriving in the Americas, from people who did work on plantations, obviously many, on sugar and tobacco and cotton fields, but also in the mines, in the silver mines and the gold mines, and other fields, and also domestic workers, but also people who had specific skills, and Africans were sought for very specific kinds of skills, like rice growing, for instance, in parts of southern United States, but also as people who could ride horses well, as horses were introduced in the western part of Africa, and there were particular skills there. And so it's not homogenous, that is the African diaspora in the Atlantic world, and certainly not in the Indian Ocean world. And so you have these figures like Ilkis Khan or Malik Ambar or Bilal ibn Rabah, who give expression to a different sort of diasporic experience than the other part of the world in terms of Africa. And that's not even to speak of sort of the Mediterranean world and the African presence there. So most famously, when we think about the transatlantic slave trade and the migration going the other way, we're talking about people being taken out of these areas of Western Africa, outside, some of these, the sort of the outskirts of some of these great empires here. And we can think of figures like, Mansa Musa, who was the great emperor from Mali. And perhaps here he's having a conversation, a fictitious conversation, of course, with Ibn Battuta, who is well known as the person who wrote this Rihla, which is basically travel journeys, which talks about how he traveled all over the Muslim world, including huge parts of the Indian Ocean world. And it's Ibn Battuta depicted here on the left, who will talk about the sort of the ferocity and the pride of Abyssinian soldiers who were commissioned to serve on merchant ships to protect them from pirates. And so Africans became well known for their military and fighting prowess across the Indian Ocean. But Malik Ambar also teaches us that Africans also had tremendous political, diplomatic, and organizing skills as administrators. And so you have a huge flow of people out going across the Atlantic, but so do you have a flow of people going across the Indian Ocean world. And I wanted to just take a moment, I'm just actually misplacing it, but there is a wonderful quote from Muhammad Khan, who was a Mughal a chronicler, who writes upon the death of Malik Ambar in 1627 that there is no record of a more eminent Abyssinian than Malik Ambar, who was known for being not only a great warrior, but a great administrator and leader. And so when your adversary, these are the Mughals, are writing about you in such a way, it obviously shows that there's a great deal of respect for who you are. I would think it would be a stretch to say that Malik Ambar was a popular figure in the sense of the 20th, 21st century, but he certainly had the respect of many people because his introduction of agricultural reforms that would allow for fallow land to be cultivated because those who would cultivate it would get returns on it, increasing sort of the amount of harvesting that would go back to the cultivators as opposed to giving most of it in taxes, made him not a beloved, but a well-respected figure. And so by agricultural reforms, which increased agricultural productivity, by fortifying the forts that existed there, having an extensive spy network, developing sort of barigiri, these guerrilla tactics, being an excellent diplomat and keeping the different forces together in that area of the Deccan, he was able to maintain his power as regent minister for a quarter of a century. So just to offer some of the references, these are coming from the book Malik Ambar, which was published by Oxford a few years ago that I wrote, a documentary source book on Islam in the Indian Ocean world, in which you'll have some of those excerpts, like the one from Muhammad Khan that I mentioned and others. And then a new 3-volume book series called Afro-South Asia in the Global African Diaspora. That's a mouthful. Afro-South Asia in the Global African Diaspora. And this volume here is about African diasporic communities. And so there is a body of literature. This just happens to be my own, but there is a growing body of literature on scholarship on the African mobility migration into the Indian Ocean world, which is an often neglected part of the world when we talk about the African diaspora, which tends to have more of an Atlantic reference. And this 3-volume series actually has about 34 contributors, ethnomusicologists, historians, literary scholars, legal historians, even some cultural film critics. It's a mix of things, and I urge you to look at these and other books if you're interested. Please email me. I would love to be in conversation with any of the folks who are on this call about this. And I'll stop there, and I'll stop the share, and we can field some questions and have conversations. So thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Very interesting and enlightening information you've shared there for someone like me who isn't a historian. It's definitely, I have a lot, I'm curious to learn more about the facts that you've shared. So I'm definitely gonna, read your books.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I do have 3 participants with their hands raised. So I'm just going to allow Emily talk, and after Emily, I'll go to Aaron and then Kwaku next.
Okay, great.
Great. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Omar Ali, for joining us virtually. I wonder, your presentation and your work is so rich. I wonder if you will indulge a question that asks you to say a little bit about what your work on this deeper historical trajectory has to tell us about contemporary narratives about African migration, African oceanic migration in the contemporary world, which is often so fraught with depictions of Africans in peril, Africans in different kinds of neoliberal struggles. This deeper historical gaze gives us another kind of perspective. And I wonder if you can indulge indulge that question a little bit and just offer some thoughts.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that. Appreciate it. I think that in some ways you were beginning to answer it, which is that the images that we have, more contemporary images of Africans, migrants in terms of going across oceans or on the oceans, are either of real victims of an exploited subjects. Like you think about the people who were trying to get to Europe, for instance, and these ships, but also very aggressive. Like I think about the Somali pirates that are depicted. And I think that in some ways it doesn't leave room for a kind of a humanity of people. And I think that's why I try to get the story out of Malik Ambar and go through his life, because not only are each of these people humans, obviously, but the complexity of who we are is vast, and the range of roles that Africans have played across the oceans is vast. As I mentioned, Africans were moving as merchants and as sailors, but also they were going out as proselytizers. There's a figure named Baba Gore who becomes a tremendously important Sufi saint and in India. And his sister, May Mishra, is as well. And in fact, in one of the instruments, there's like sort of this gourd that's carried, and it's called the May Mishra in her honor. But so they were going as proselytizers. They were also just going as explorers. Like, I mean, I think that it's not just Europeans or maybe a Chinese like Zheng He who have a monopoly on exploration. I mean, Africans have been exploring from the very beginnings, not only the continent, but parts of the world. Even in the transatlantic slave trade, you have Africans aboard some of the early ships and who were part of these actually conquistador missions, which is super interesting and almost confusing, but that's part of the history. And so Africans were moving around for many, many reasons and performed many roles, including as warriors, as bodyguards, as palace guards, and as military, as generals, as Malik Ambar becomes, but also as administrators and ministers of finance and artists. And so Malik Ambar, one of the things that he did is he built a city named Kadki, and he commissioned people to create beautiful architecture. And so there's these beautiful pieces of architecture that were created. And so as artists and as musicians, I mentioned, we saw some of the depictions of the musicians in this area of Gujarat. So I think that what we want to do is bring out the great diversity of humanity and the very humanity of people and how they've developed. So that's maybe a little bit how I might respond to that.
That's great. Thank you so much. And that's such a great teachable gesture for our students.
Mm.
Thank you, Emily. We have a question from Aaron McKinnon. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. He has his hand raised as well. So I'm just going to ask the question and ask him if that's all he wanted. Oh, he disabled his hands. So I guess that's the question. So Aaron says, is there a case to be made for calling it the Swahili Ocean as opposed to the Indian Ocean? I recently heard a Kenyan writer refer to it as the former.
Oh, that is so excellent. I have to say that I'm going to note that down, and I will have to remember Aaron McKinnon taught me this. The ocean is called different things by different people. So the Greeks called it the Erythraean Sea. And so depending on who is, who's speaking, they'll call it different things. So I think that speaks to historical perspective and historical agency. So I see a perfect case for calling it the Swahili Ocean, especially if you're talking about the African diaspora. But it's also true that the Swahili are made up of different kinds of people. We know that in some ways the language Swahili has many sort of its syntax is Bantu, but many of the words, the lexicon comes from other areas of that part of the world, including Arab borrowings and Persian borrowings, and later on English and other languages. So it's a mix of different traditions there. So I think that ultimately it's whoever is in power who decides to determine the categories and the naming of things. So that's very intriguing. Yeah, thank you for that, Erin.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Kwaku, and then we'll come back to Vicky Revine's question. Hi, Kwaku, can you hear us?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, when you started talking about, what's the name, Malik Ambar, yeah, you referred to him, he was an enslaved person, you know, so all along, yeah, I heard you talking about the enslaved people who were taken out of Africa across that part of the world. Then along the line, yeah, you made mention of the fact that Africans went there as merchants, soldiers, sailors, etc. I hope I understand. Yeah.
Yes.
In your interaction with the documents or primary sources, do you have a sense, by way of percentages, are you able to tell us what percentage of Africans, you know, in that part of the world, you know, went there as enslaved people? I know it's difficult, but I'm just asking, what percentage of them went there as enslaved people, as soldiers, as merchants, as explorers, or as fishermen, or something of that sort?
It's an excellent question. We don't have a sort of a percentage breakdown, but we know in different periods of time there was more of one category. So for a period of time from like the 15th, 16th, 17th century, there was a great flow of military slaves, but also that were coming over as mercenaries. So it's sort of a mix. But overall numbers, so when we talk about the Atlantic world, we know that it's like 10.7 million, about 11 million people that were taken out of mostly West, Central West, and also Southeast Africa. There are 700,000 people were taken out of Southeast Africa, the area of Mozambique, to the Atlantic world for the slave trade. The general consensus is that about 4 million people were taken out of Africa into different parts of the Indian Ocean world over a much longer period of time than in the Atlantic. So basically over the course of about 20 centuries, you had 4 million as opposed to 11 million over the course of about 3.5 or 4 centuries. So the impact is going to be different there. So, so it changes over time, and I don't know if we'll ever be able to find out that information. It's on the Atlantic, right? Yeah, on the Atlantic side, there's much more detailed records because of insurance, actually records, which about a lot. Yeah, thank you for that, Kwaku.
Thank you so much.
Oh yeah.
Thank you, Kwaku. I'm going to pose Dr. Revine's question, and actually, I'm going to pose 2 questions in the Q&A box, and then once you're done answering, we'll go to the hands that are raised, and we'll take those. So Dr. Revine says, I'm curious. She first of all thanks you for the fascinating talk, and I am curious to know whether people in the Horn of Africa today, maybe students and those with an interest in history, are aware of this lineage of Somalis, Ethiopians, and others in distant parts of the Indian Ocean world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. One of the things that Ada mentioned was my work with Sylviane Diouf. Sylviane Diouf was a former curator of digital exhibits at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library. And about 10 years ago, we did an exhibit, and there was a physical exhibit that was done with Kenneth Robbins, who was one of the co-editors of this 3-volume book that I did. But the online exhibit called Africans in the Indian Ocean World has been viewed millions of times all over the world. It was actually picked up by UNESCO. It's now, I just found out because the site went down, that you can actually still access it through Wayback Machine. And if somebody wants to email me and look at it, it's available that way still. So that's kind of cool. And folks can email me directly. It's OH Ali. Is there somewhere where I can type it? Maybe I can just I'll type it here in response to Rovine, Victoria.
Yes, you can put it there or in the chat box as well.
Okay, I'm just going to put it there, .edu, but feel free to contact me and I can send you that link because it's kind of cool that you can access it still. But okay, so the thing is that most people in Ethiopia and Somalia in the Swahili are not aware of this. When I did research, this is now a number of years ago, it was really brand new knowledge to many academics there. When I was in Tanzania or in Addis Ababa, when I was speaking at the universities, the historians, the geographers, and others were just like, wait, what? And so now that was about almost 10 years ago now. So there's more knowledge about that. I did end up publishing some stuff in some of the popular press there just to educate. And so we used the website as a way of developing sort of greater knowledge, but more is known on the South Asian side of this African presence because the Africans are there. And there was a traveling exhibit, as I mentioned, by Diouf and Kenneth Robbins that made its way across that part of the world, but it actually hasn't been shown in Addis yet. And so that's something that would be great to do to draw some attention. But it's a source of enormous pride, actually, to talk about Malik Ambar, because people are like, wow, this is new, and this is an extraordinary story among other, big figures of Ethiopian and people coming out of the Horn of Africa in particular. So the answer, sorry, I feel like I rambled a little bit, is that people do not generally know that much about the Africans in India, in the Horn of Africa.
Okay. I'm gonna allow Ratsimba Harrison talk. And yes.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
We can.
Yes, thank you, Professor, for this very informative talk. And as you know, I'm from that part of the world. I'm originally from Madagascar, and I used to be an historian before becoming a polyglot scientist. And like the other people who are in East Africa, who heard your talk before, this is new to me also.
Yeah.
So it's really curious that the role of Africans was kind of dismissed in the history, in the historiography of the Indian Ocean. But on the other hand, the role of the Arabs and the Indonesians who came to Madagascar were really emphasized. But my question is really about the source, and are they accessible? How do you access, the kind of source that you are using? And
well,
part of history, yeah.
Yeah. So forgive me. Sorry about that. I interrupted you. Did you want to say something else?
No, that's all. Because it really depends. It depends on the source that the historians have access.
Yes.
So we cannot really blame those people who are writing the history of Madagascar,
yes,
Comoros, and they don't know anything about the role of the Africans.
Right.
They know more about the Arabs. They know a lot about the Indonesians, but not about the Africans who actually were part of this exchange.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's I mentioned this book, this Islam in the Indian Ocean World, which does contain documents that do speak to the African presence in the Indian Ocean. You have to I love documentary sources because it pulls together stuff in a way that can be used for teaching and to deepen understanding. But most of the source material that I use come from a combination of Mughal sources, so the court chronicler like Muhammad Khan, some ambassadors' exchanges, letters. One ambassador in particular, Asad Beg, basically talks about Malik Ambar, for instance, going down into the ranks of his army and leading Quranic recitation. And then there are these Dutch accounts, Pieter van den Broek, which has several pages on him meeting. He's a Dutch trader meeting Malik Ambar and interacting with him. So it's sort of, it's like little pieces here and there. So a lot of this is being pulled together. And in my book on Malik Anbar, in the back of the book, and I actually inaugurated this for the Oxford University series, I said to the editors, Bonnie Gill and Bonnie Smith in particular, we need to have the documents accompany these biographies that are being written, because then teachers and students can see where is it coming from. And so in the back of my Malik Anbar book, there's a couple dozen documents, excerpts mostly from the source material, so that you can go to that. So that's one place where they're gathered. But I think the point is that there's still a lot more work to try to pull it together and digitize it in a space. And I do have plans to try to do some more of that work. So thank you for your question, and you know, yeah.
All right, I'm going to quickly breeze through the questions we have in the box. Aisha Mohammed says, thank you for your talk. I noticed that a lot of the images shown are Mughal influenced in style. What kind of art patron was Malik Anbar? Did he privilege one style over the other?
That's a great question. I think my assessment, and speaking to art historians as well, that he was very influenced, I believe, by the Persianate styles coming out of his stay in the Middle East. And when he was also, so some Arab styles, but Persianate styles in Baghdad, and that then it gets expressed through the Mughals, right? And so it does have that kind of a quote bias towards a sort of a more Mughal architecture, but it's infused with sort of Hindu traditions as well. And so but it's mostly sort of Islamic, Mughal-ish, if you will, styles there, definitely.
Matthew says, Michael Pearson discusses debates over the name of the ocean in one of his books. Depending on who's telling the story, there are many different names. He settles on the Afro-Asian Sea.
Afro-Asian Sea, yeah. Michael Pearson is one of the real pioneers and sort of giants of Indian Ocean history. And I think that that's true. I think Afro-Asian Sea is a great way of talking about it. I like it because it foregrounds the African side of it. And so that's certainly true of the western part of the Indian Ocean. Because as I mentioned, the eastern side doesn't have as much of an African presence. There's some, but very little. And so I think that the Afro-Asian Sea is a reference to the western part of the Indian Ocean.
All right, I'm going to let Moses, I'm sure Moses's hand is hurting now. It's been raised for a while. So I'm going to take his question and come back to the last two questions we have here. Hi, Moses.
Hi there. You hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Omar. Moses Isa here. I am at NC State University in the Political Science Department and also Africana Studies. I mean, your talk is very fascinating, and I've learned a lot. I've been teaching an intro to the African diaspora class, and so this is great stuff for me. And, you know, coming from political science, I previously knew nothing about what I'm currently teaching. And so I've been doing a lot of learning, and your talk is very, very fascinating. As you know, Paul Zeleza has written about the Atlantic bias in African diaspora studies. And, your talk that, talks about the other side, with the Indian Ocean, African diaspora is very interesting in that regard. I wanted to ask you about this issue of the Atlantic bias. So, there's the argument about integration as a result of the type of slave trade that happened across the Indian Ocean, as you mentioned.
Yes.
It made integration easier and possible for many of the African peoples who were taken in that direction. But still, we don't know a lot. Even with integration and less boundary maintenance, you'd have expected that we would have more traces of, African peoples who went across the Indian Ocean to South Asia, but also up north to the Middle East. So in your more recent work, I don't know where you would nail the issue to be, as regards to sort of the lost African diasporas across the Indian Ocean?
Well, it's a good question. And I would love to stay in touch and maybe even visit your class one day, because I'm always looking for opportunities to share this history. So if you find it helpful, please call me
Absolutely.
up.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it would be my pleasure, my honor.
Thank you.
I think that one of the things that gets lost is, it actually, as it turns out, is the naming, right? Because when people adopt Islam, and I use the word adopt as opposed to convert. I always had I have an issue with the issue of conversion, because conversion suggests almost like people like wholesale drop everything of who they are and sort of adopt and sort of only take this one thing. Adoption and it's sort of taking aspects of a religion, and that's, to me, is it's much more dialectical and sort of syncretic, if you will. And even though I know that word syncretic has some issues there, but I think one of the things that gets lost is that when people rename themselves Muslim names, then a lot of it's harder to trace the African roots of people. So that's been a challenge. One of my colleagues, I mentioned him, Kenneth Robbins, has done really extraordinary work in trying to pull out the African descendants of different figures. And he actually does that with also the Jewish diaspora in South Asia. But he's done really an amazing job. And in our 3-volume series, he has in some ways he's gone both ways, where some people who are claimed to be African, he shows that they may not have been, and vice versa. And I think that there's a kind of an honesty in his analysis, which doesn't try to make things that are not something because it fits the argument. So I think naming creates a problem there. But I think also, like, our notions of race in the Atlantic world are very much binary, especially in North America. Now, I know that in Brazil, there's like 130 categories of different, race and distinctions. And of course, sort of there's this notion of the castas in Latin America of descent, Spanish, and this percentage, what is a mix of a Spanish and Indian and an African, first generation, second generation. But I think that our modern notions of race overdetermine and kind of muddy our understanding or efforts to understand Africans in the Indian Ocean world. So I would just say that those are some challenges, but I think one of the biggest challenges is around the naming when people begin to use Muslim names, because then it becomes very difficult to tell. So those are just some initial sort of thoughts about it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Omar. Thanks, Moses. We have 5 minutes left. I want to make sure people go and get dinner on time.
Yeah.
So we have 2 questions. One is from Brandy Simpson Miller. Brandy says, thank you for the talk. And her question is, are you aware of any historical investigation of the Indian Ocean foodways and the influences that were exchanged? Is a food history approach used to study this area? She also has a second question, and I'm going to read that out now. And can you tell us about any of the fabrics used in the beautiful image?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that with regards to the second question, in terms of the fabrics, there's this wonderful work on quilting that the CD communities have. And I have to just say that Henry Druell is perhaps the person who's best known for that, but there is a tradition of quilting among Siddhis in India that would be of great interest, I think, to you. I don't know that much about some of the fabrics in the images, and I'm actually embarrassed to say that I've never really thought about it, other than just on the surface, like it looks really beautiful. And this is partly why I like to teach and present, because you get pushed to think of things in new ways. So I would have to do some more work on that, but it makes me think that maybe, I don't know if your expertise is in this area, but I could draw on some of the expertise of colleagues at my university to begin looking at that. So I really appreciate that question. And then with regards to foodways, actually one of my former graduate students, Purvi Sanghvi, who's now in Georgia doing her PhD, is somebody who's actually begun working on this. It's not an area that I'm that knowledgeable about, but I think that's a very compelling and interesting area of work to be developed. So I could put you in touch with her if you're interested. Mm-hmm. Oh, you're welcome so much. Thank you, Brandy.
And Beth Whitaker says, to what extent do African descended communities in South Asia self-identify as part of the African diaspora? That's a great question. And how does the long history of migration from Africa to South Asia and from South Asia to Africa influence relations among these regions today?
Okay. There's a lot to say about that second one, which that's a big topic. But let me just say that, the first part of the question, I'm really tired right now. The first part, which was about the, help me out here, Ada.
Beth, it's about African descended communities identifying as part of the diaspora.
So I think immediately there of Shihan De Silva Jayasuriya, who's my colleague and friend, who's done ethnographic work in Sri Lanka. And I think that anthropologists and historians going into these communities and basically saying this is who you are has changed things over the last generation or two. We know that in some of the songs, look at Sri Lanka, people talk about this notion of an African homeland. But as more and more people as more scholars and students are talking to Sidi communities, they begin to take on some of these ideas. And not to say that they're not original in their own, but it's sort of a mixture of those two. And so we know that whenever you study people, you are going to influence them in some way or another, and that includes their identity. But as Sidis are going through a process of really trying to assert their civil and political rights in India, and some of them have schedule status of tribal schedule status, which gives them a kind of affirmative action, but that's not universal across all those Sidi communities. So I hope that helps to answer. I know that we are running out of time here.
Yeah, this is interesting. So I can see how we can go over time, but so thank you so much, Omar. Before I end this session, I want to encourage everyone still logged on to visit the website to see the conference schedule for tomorrow. And I also put it in the chat box for easy access. We start tomorrow at 9 a.m. and please note that all the sessions tomorrow, except for the last one at 3:30, will run concurrently. And I believe everyone would have received the login details for the panel sessions. If you haven't, please feel free to contact me or my colleagues, Stacy or Abby. So thank you again. Thank you for joining us. I hope you all have a good evening and see you all tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you, Omar.
Have a good night. Thank you so much.
Have a good time. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.